Amy Walter is the national editor of the Cook Political Report. Michael Duffy is deputy managing editor of Time magazine. Ben Domenech is the publisher of The Federalist. And Ed O'Keefe is a CBS News contributor and covers Congress for The Washington Post. Let's start with health care. We'll talk also about other news in the week. But Ben, what's going to happen? Is this bill going to live in its current form, or pass in its current form, I should say?
It's important to understand that this is not the bill. This is a bill. This is to get to the point where you have the bill. Getting to that conference is something that I think ultimately will be supported by a number of the senators who have come out with questions early on. This is, frankly, an insult to Kabuki. They could do a better job of this. This is a group of senators who really will be there at the end of the day. There are a couple
Meaning the critics.
Meaning the critics.
Right, so they're saying they're against it to get leverage room.
They want to have a few things done. They want to have a few changes. It's important, though, I think, to step back and look at the picture of Obamacare here after it's been in existence for quite a while. The truth is that Obamacare failed to do what President Obama wanted it to do when it came to this middle portion of the private insurance market. It really did not lead to the kind of competitive exchanges that he wanted to see. What did succeed, and what you've been talking about with these senators this morning, is the Medicaid expansion. It added millions more people than the CBO estimated to a program that, frankly, was already strained in a number of different states. And fixing that fiscal problem is the key question when it comes to all of these issues. You know, you mentioned Governor Kasich. When Governor Kasich, pushed for the Medicaid expansion in Ohio, he ended up having to throw 34,000 disabled people off of the program because it incentivized adding these working, able-bodied adults over people who actually were in the system who had disabilities or had other dependents. So getting that fix right is the key argument internally, I think. And I expect the Republican bill will end up being even more generous than it currently is.
Ed, what's your sense of it in the Hill?
I think the fact that you see Senator Cassidy and others this morning saying let's not necessarily do it this week. Don't be surprised then if maybe McConnell is convinced to wait one more week, allow things to percolate a little more, because trying to get it done by Saturday morning at this point, that'd be a really ugly rush job. But Ben is correct, and I think people need to remember this. This bill, more than any other this year, has gone through more verses of the Schoolhouse Rock song on how bills become law than others. They skipped the committee verses. But the fact that this thing is still in play, still being negotiated, and if passed, will go into a broader negotiation with the House is important. And this is by no means over. You're going to see this week all sorts of proposals to tweak this, either to favor people like those that are holding out, Ted Cruz and Mike Lee, but also potentially some changes, including restoring the funding for Planned Parenthood, which would spark a pretty uncomfortable vote potentially on the floor of the Senate.
Amy, the longer this is alive, though, the theory goes, the longer it's out in the public, the more potentially politically problematic it becomes.
And it already has been. I mean, I think there's another piece of this, which is there's the policy piece, there's the whether it's going to pass piece, and then there is the how do Republicans actually sell this out on the campaign trail and, of course, to their constituents. And what we've seen in this time when it's been in this legislative purgatory between when the House passed it till now, support for this bill has actually gone down, even among Republicans. Democrats know quite well what happens when the other side defines your bill and you don't. In 2010, there were 420,000 ads run during the 2010 campaign that mentioned Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. 380,000 of those ads were negative. And Democrats have now spent the last 5 years trying to make actually, I think they haven't effectively made the case for Obamacare, as well as they're doing it right now as a defense of it rather than a promotion of it. So can Republicans promote this bill, I think, is going to be very important once they actually pass it. Democrats didn't do a particularly good job of it, or Republicans do a better job.
And Michael, give me your thoughts, but also what role does the president play? Does he come on stage? Does he stay off? Or does he just work the phone?
I think most people on the Hill would prefer he stay off at the moment. I think another thing to point out about what happens next is Ben talked about a Kabuki to give people cover for bargaining for more time or more money or whatever it is they want. But the Kabuki mostly serves the two great big pieces of Republican orthodoxy at the center of this measure, which is a massive $1 trillion tax cut, mostly on high-wealth individuals over the next 10 years. But that happens pretty quickly. And the second is this for the first time really in 23 years, a reduction in a federal entitlement program. That admittedly was only put into place in 2010 with ACA, but this is going to reduce the number of people who get essentially federal payments by 10, 20, we're not sure, some number of tens of millions of people. That hasn't happened by a Congress since welfare reform. Normally that's political suicide, but I don't think any of us would think that we live in normal political times.
Right. And, you know, Senator Toomey said, well, it's going to slow the rate of growth, but there are no cuts. But the Congressional Budget Office has said that of the 23 million who will lose coverage, that 14 or so will come from Medicaid. They will give another score this week, which will undoubtedly put a number on people losing coverage. So who wins in that debate? Somebody who's saying, suggesting essentially this is going to be as it is, and then CBO who's saying all these people are going to lose coverage.
You know, one of the things that I have been skeptical about as it comes to this approach is not an ideological bit of skepticism, but just a practical one. This is a massive undertaking. You know, reforming something that affects the lives of so many different millions of Americans in a very direct way can always have unexpected consequences. President Obama certainly saw that with his bill, and HHS had to work very hard under Kathleen Sebelius to try to mitigate a lot of those different changes that happened. I think you're going to see the same thing happen here. This is a dog's breakfast of the bill. There's all sorts of different things thrown in there that senators have problems with, have issues with. But again, they want to get to the point of actually being able to send this to the president's desk. I've never, said that you should underestimate Mitch McConnell's ability to get something like that done. And I think, frankly, he's going to plow through a lot of these different concerns, add various aspects to the bill to try to satisfy individual senators and get there eventually.
And it seems like promise kept is the biggest selling point for this. How does that work over time, though? Well, is that great and that's all that matters?
That's the test that Amy's talking about. You can keep the promise, but then how good are you going to be next year at selling this and promoting it and defending it? And I think we don't know. But I agree with Ben that I think the big test right now is Mitch McConnell really has never had to steer, I've said this before, has never had to steer a significant piece of legislation like this through the Senate in these times of, social media pressure and the polarization of politics. If he can get this through, it bodes well, I think, for his tax reform debate that he really wants to have, but he's got a lot of other tricky things coming this fall. He's got to do a budget. He's got to reauthorize a bunch of other federal programs. If this goes south, it's going to be very difficult for him, I think, to hold together his Republicans, especially when the president is still as unpopular as he is, and as some of these Democratic attacks are working. The other thing, and I had some Senate Republican folks point this out, and I think it's a fair point. What they're doing is a lighter, more diet version of what the House did. What's being polled right now is the House bill. Right. We haven't seen a poll yet on the changes that are made here. We may not see that for another few weeks to get a real sense of the changes. So they point out we haven't even really started to explain what's in our bill yet, since it only just came out. And I suspect the numbers may change, especially among Republicans, as this negotiation continues.
Amy, do you want to jump in there?
Go ahead.
Let's talk quickly about the race in the 6th District of Georgia, because what we're talking about here is how this plays out politically. Everybody was watching that race to see if it was a harbinger of 2018. Give us your takeaway now that it has happened. The Democrat lost, the Republican won. What does it mean?
Right. What does it all mean? One race, 18 months out from an election. Of course, it's going to tell us everything that we need to know. There's a little something for each party to like and to be scared about. For Republicans, they won in a district, the Republican candidate won in a district that Donald Trump barely carried. That's good news for them because there are only 23 seats right now that Republicans hold that Donald Trump did not win. Guess what? They have a 24-seat majority. If they lose all of those, they still have a 1-seat majority. The bad news is when you look at not just Georgia 6, but all the other special elections that have taken place, all in very Republican districts, Democrats have been outperforming their generic performance by about 7 points. If they did that, if Democrats outperformed what they normally get, they would win 80 seats. Right? So there's somewhere that this is going to meet in the middle. And this is where the issue, like healthcare, is going to play. We don't know how that issue is going to play out. It didn't really play here. Once there's a bill, or quite frankly, even if there's not, Republicans control Washington. Obamacare is an issue. They either fix it or they don't, but it's now theirs and they own it.
Michael, it seemed there was a moment where people were asking about Nancy Pelosi and was she the leader that the Democrats want? And the people said the knives are out for Nancy Pelosi, but at the end it seemed like it was the butter knives were out for Nancy Pelosi. She's not going anywhere.
No, she would probably say they were butter knives too. The most important thing I think about this race is that something like $50 million at least was spent on a House race. That's a record by half again. I think the nearest one was
Yes.
20, 24. So this is $200 per vote, which is really quite an astonishing number, given what
And won't
even in
happen.
even in our campaign finance system, it can't be sustained. But I think the other things that were happening is that the Republican interest groups unified around the idea of hanging Nancy Pelosi around John Ossoff's neck. Like, rarely has she been hung before. They called him, as they have for 25 years, a San Francisco-style liberal, and they worked together in ways they typically don't, which suggests Republicans are a little more cohesive as well. And I would say
that's all they have.
That's right. One other thing that's worth noting, even in the case of little things I saw, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce got local chambers of commerce in the district to work with their members and get their employees to get active in the polls. So there's a level of grassroots involvement in this race.
But there are two key things about this race that we need to keep in mind. First, this race was truly nationalized in a way that I think negatively affected the Democrats in it. The amount of money that was flowing in from California, the national attention that it received, actually worked against them in this race. You saw how close the race was in South Carolina, which had none of that national attention, but where the Democrat significantly overperformed. Secondly, you had the shooting in Alexandria by a frankly radical leftist who had been very public about that fact on his social media, including talking about this race and talking about beating the Republican in that race. While that didn't receive a lot of national attention, it got significant attention on local news programs in Georgia 6th. And you saw the polls on, in the days running up to that election go from 2 or 3 points down for the Republican to 2 or 3 points ahead. We should not underestimate the fact that that shooting had a significant impact. And frankly, John, this week we saw in Washington, we talk a lot on this program about the degradation of faith in institutions. And you saw the FBI come out with this report that said that effectively the shooter was just someone who had anger management issues, that this was some random effect for someone who sat out in a van across from this nondescript baseball park in Alexandria and clearly had the intent of doing what he did. That had an extraordinarily negative effect for Democrats in this race.
Real quick, spent most of the week outside of Washington talking to these Democrats who are starting to run, and they made very clear, stop talking about Russia, they said to party leaders. Nobody out here cares. Talk to us about the economy, about how you defend or preserve Obamacare. Let's see whether party leaders actually pay attention to that.
Excellent. Thanks to all of you. That's where we're going to end for now. We'll be right back with a look at whether North Korea can be stopped.